But Bryan is the curator of Native American materials at the Library and Museum of the American Philosophical Society. He arrived at the APS in 2008 on a 6-year project to digitize and catalog all of the library's 3,000 plus hours of audio recordings of Indigenous languages of the Americas. Since then, he's worked with over, is it 80 now, Bryan, or is it more than that? Native American communities.
It's around that, maybe more. I don't really keep track so much.
He's worked with over 80 plus Indigenous communities throughout the Americas to connect them with the APS holdings. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that today for a project that has recently been funded by the NSF to engage with language revitalization between the APS and the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bryan, who will be speaking about creating the Indigenous languages manuscript interface through the Tunica Language Transcription Project. Take it away, Bryan.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you for everyone for coming in today. And I know there's some folks from Louisiana, from Marksville, visiting as well. I'm glad to have you here. And I'm going to use the opportunity, this particular setting of, as Adriana encourages, to have kind of a more informal conversational kind of presentation. This is sort of a bit loose, kind of putting it together. This is also a good way to sort of practice for talking about the project as a whole. So bear with me as I kind of talk through this with you as well. There's a lot of pieces to it. Basically, what I'd like to, the sequence of things is I'd like to begin kind of telling you what's the materials, the archival materials that are really the focus of it, and then we'll get into who's all involved in the project. There's many different people doing different things, and we'll look a little bit about what we're trying to build, and then we'll talk about what this language manuscripts interface overall is, and kind of why there's a need for a thing like this, and some things we envision, additional future applications of this we see beyond just this particular very important inaugural project for it, to build it. So what you're looking at here is a open page of one of the Tunica language notebooks. We'll see plenty more screenshots of manuscript pages, so I won't linger over this one. Let's talk about first about what the material is. Second. So these notebooks that are at the APS, they were recorded by the linguist Mary Haas with Mistress Sostre Uchigan, who you see here. There's a picture on the right was from the 1930s when Mary Haas was working with him. It's a photograph that she took. On photo on the left, I think, is from the 19-teens. He's there in the middle with some other important members of the tribe from the community. Mr. Uchigan was chief for a while. He was an important figure. I don't know the details of his biography enough to really give you a fuller sense, but there is a very great publication that the tribe put together in the last recent years that talks about him. And the important thing to know is he's the last known fluent speaker of Tunica. The notebooks were created. Mary Haas is the other piece of the puzzle here. Mary Haas is a linguist who is one of the most prolific linguists of American Indigenous languages in the 20th century. You see her there in the middle from the 70s, but she started her fieldwork career in the 1930s. There on the left, she's on her first fieldwork trip in British Columbia. And then I think on the right is from one, she spent a number of years, late 30s and throughout the 30s, working with a number of different languages and speakers in Oklahoma especially, but also into some related regions. So that's where she met Sostre Uchigan, who was in Oklahoma for a time, but as well as in Marksville, Louisiana, which is where the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe is based. which is, if you don't know Louisiana, it's sort of central Louisiana. So Haas is a very important figure. She is, her teachers were Edward Sapir, who was Franz Boas's probably most prominent linguistic student. He's a better linguist than Boas was. And Boas helped fund a lot of Haas's field work in the 1930s as well. And she was just got things done more quickly than a lot of linguists did at the time. Extremely high quality. And she also became a very important figure in the history of linguistics after, in the 50s, she became she went to Berkeley, and for her decades there, she taught more linguistics PhD students than Boas and Sapir combined. So she's a really towering figure, and her papers at the APS arrived just after she passed away in the 90s. And many people who knew of her work in both communities and linguists were eager to start working with her materials. And that's in part how this project came about. So the notebooks themselves, there are 14 of them. You'll say, why am I seeing notebook 15 here? That's because there is no notebook 13 for, I suppose, reasons of superstition. Here's a photo again of Mr. Uchigan on the left. This is my favorite photo of him because you can see kind of you can see that nice 30s looking car. I don't know if this is in Oklahoma or in Louisiana. I think it's in Louisiana, but I haven't figured that out yet. I'm pretty sure it's in Louisiana. She, from her notebooks, which each notebook is about 200 pages. Not every page is full, but you're thinking 2,000 plus pages of material. From this, she, in the 40s and 50s, she produced a grammar, a set of texts, which is stories, and a dictionary. So this is the sort of trifecta of what you're supposed to, and the sort of Americanist linguistics, what you're supposed to produce from working on a language. So she got all this done. So you may think, well, there's all this amazing material was published. That's really important. Why do we need the original manuscripts? Well, this body of manuscripts that she and Sosostri put together is the largest body of documentation of the Tunica language that was ever created. There were some previous anthropologists and linguists who worked with other Tunica speakers earlier, but is not as extensive and, as I'm told, not as easy to use in some respects. So in the notebooks themselves, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't really appear in the published materials. So let's look at a few different kinds of things that we find in the notebooks themselves. There are kind of three things I'd point to. One is what is often called, what a linguist would just call texts. Sorry. So this is interlinear text. This is the method that Boas really developed, where you have you'll see a line in the language itself, and then interlinear, parallel with it, the corresponding English. So texts just refer to any kind of story. It could be a traditional story. This one is like how to sort of do something, how some things were made. Text could be a speech or just any kind of anecdote about anything. So this is a particular format in which narratives, so to speak, were recorded. When they're published, they're often published in a similar kind of way with this parallel translation. And then there would be what they would call a free translation, which would render the English in the order that makes sense in English syntax order. So even though this story was published, there's a lot of information in her sort of putting it together, figuring out how to represent certain sounds, changes in translations, changes in how she did her work over the course of it. In the elicitations is another category of a broad range of things, and I think a linguist might make me say this more precisely, but I'll say it more broadly, which is that elicitations are things like word lists, vocabulary lists, but also, as you're seeing here, different kinds of phrases. So there will be big large sections of the notebooks where she's working with Sesostri on figuring out how different grammatical forms work. And so here she's going through some different kinds of related phrases. So seeing these sections of elicitations, these kinds of information informed what ended up in the dictionary and in the grammar, but these weren't published straight up. There's gazillion additional examples of language use and formation that doesn't appear in publications. And what's really valuable also in seeing these in sequence in the notebooks themselves is it gives you a picture of her methodology in trying to figure out different aspects of the language and their kind of workflow, so to speak, of how they, how does one proceed with figuring out how a language works. So what you can see about Haas here as well is that her handwriting's fairly easy to work with, nice and big. She gives a lot of space for it. It's very systematic. It's not messy. So it's a very good example. There's great potential in using it. And there's also a lot of cultural notes in here, in just she and Sesostri working together. You would make different observations about different types of things. So they're going through some names for different kind of animals. And you can tell that there's a word came up for something that she says is probably elk, but then he explains kind of what he's talking about. And there's many sections where there's these like side comments on various things. There are also other sections where there's, it is just more straight text. It's not even linguistic. It's just sort of ethnographic notes, so to speak. So this is all extremely valuable, important information. We've been working got to know the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe's Language and Cultural Revitalization Program for a few years. They've known about this material obviously for decades, and it's been a clear focus of wanting around which they have been working to revitalize the language and build new generations of speakers. We got to know, got in touch with them through Councilwoman Brenda Littinger, who you see on the left. She, as well as other people, were spurred on working with, contributed to the expansion of those programs. One of the things they started doing was working with the Tulane University Linguistics graduate program, and creating something called the Tunica Language Project, which is a collaboration between the tribe and the Tulane linguistics students on basically the linguistic students making themselves useful to the tribe's goals in researching the language, developing new pedagogical materials. The tribe did other things such as creating children's books around some of the stories that Sesostri told, as you see on the bottom left here. So they wanted to work with the original notebooks. I think we first met folks from the program in 2013. And at that time, the Haas papers was still unprocessed. But we did scans such as we could do them at the time and got them to folks. But then over the subsequent years, we've had better equipment, better digitization, better digital repository, and so forth. So we've been getting better and better versions together, and they've been working with it. But they've really been wanting for a number of years a way to transcribe everything that's in the notebooks, to really get it all down. Because getting it out in full detail allows them to do a whole lot more than just being able to, than you can do from just perusing it and browsing it. Even with Haas's fairly orderly way of putting together notebooks, there's only so much that can be done without transcription. So they have other programs going on there as well, such as adult immersion classes. Just a huge number of programs. You should take a look at their site in terms of how many things are going out throughout the year. There's many classes and events around cultural cultural teachings, how to do different types of things throughout the year. They've also got a grant from the from ANA to create these 5 language apprentice positions. These are the 5 language apprentices. This is a screenshot from a presentation that Elizabeth Pirret-Mora, who's one of the language experts, language teachers there, she gave with Patricia Anderson, who's one of the main linguists and who's the lead linguist on this NSF project. They gave a presentation during our the NACI conference in September. So if you go to our YouTube channel and you look up the panels there, the panel number 4, which is on community-based language revitalization, they gave the first talk on that. And so they give a really good summation in that talk of the history of the program and the work that they've been doing. So I would defer to them that gives the most comprehensive picture of the nitty-gritty of how they've been doing things over the years. And so the grant we have from we've been in talking with them, all these folks for a number of years. We said, well, how can we get, what's a way that we could get everything transcribed? Is there a way that us at the APS as an archive could contribute to that broader goal? And are there goals that would be also beneficial to things that the APS wants to do as well, to making the materials more easy to use, make sense of? So we put together this grant project, of which through the Dynamic Language Infrastructure Grant Program. This was previously called the Documenting Endangered Languages Program, which is really a component of NSF focused on creating funding opportunities for people working on endangered languages, especially in the Americas, but around the world. So the main goals of the project are to transcribe all of the information in the notebooks, literally verbatim, get everything down. We're doing this in a program that's called Flex, which is it's called the Fieldworks Explorer. It is a program that is designed for working with linguistic material and creating various analyses and ways of working with linguistic data. And here on the left, you see one of the language apprentices, Ryan Lopez, who's doing some transcription of one of the notebooks. And on the right, you have Patricia Anderson, who's on one of their visits to, one of the group's visits to the APS, looking at some of the note cards from which Haas derived some information from the notebooks. The idea is to create not just a full transcription that's for use within the context of this Flex software program itself, but also is there a way that could be used as a basis to make the notebooks themselves more usable? We have being able to digitize the materials and put them up in our digital library. We're able to make the materials accessible and findable, but when you have a digitized notebook before you in a digital library, it's not necessarily any more usable in that context than if you're there with it in person. You can browse it in different ways in person. Often having it in person, you can explore in a different way than you can with in an online setting. So we thought, how can we use the occasion of doing this full transcription of the notebooks as a way to actually make it easier to navigate, make it searchable. So if you want to zero in on certain content in the notebooks, and thereby make it more of a usable, quickly usable type of resource. And from this, find a way to make from all the work being done on that and subsequent work to be done on more in-depth linguistic analysis of the material in the notebooks. Use that as an occasion to create a broader portal to the language notebooks as an occasion in which Tunica-Biloxi Tribe can actually create its own sort of portal to the notebooks at the APS in which they can provide commentary on various aspects of what's in there, demonstrations of different things. And so we're part of the project is to, and sort of the second year of the project is to build a broader Tunica language portal. And from this, we also wanted to stress that in creating this, it's not just a one-off project. There are these kind of field notebooks that we see from Haas. There are hundreds, thousands of notebooks like that. Is really the sort of standard way in which linguistic manuscripts were, fieldwork was done for most of the 20th century. And contemporary born digital linguistic fieldwork is really doing the same thing, just imitated in a digital format. So how can we create it from this, create an interface that could then be applied to other digitized language notebooks, especially. So the goals in how to understand what this kind of interface that we're looking for is to not just have a transcription be available, but to have a sorry, toggling between screens here, to have the transcriptions be visible and tied to the actual images of the manuscripts pages themselves. Because from looking through the manuscripts themselves, there's a great deal of contextual information that cannot be represented in a transcription alone. And the idea is that the transcription and what it allows for keyword searching, for having anchors to different sections of notebooks, such as like a table of contents that allows you to navigate. That then opens up ways to explore the original as well in ways that a transcription, again, by itself, divorced from the original, would not fully allow. It also allows for, in the sort of more scientific angle of linguistics, for people to check the work, to see what else is missing, to see what Haas's process was. An eventual goal is to also have not just keyword searchability and table of contents navigation, but also to have tagging for different types of content types. So we're using TEI, which is a text encoding initiative. It's a way of marking up online documents, and it's often used for manuscript collections. And in the second year of the project, we're just a few months into this project now. It started in August. In the second year, one of the components after the full transcription is done will be to tag different components of the content, basically, and this will be really centered around discussions with language learners and teachers or the tribe themselves. Like, given a portal in which you can search for text, how would you like to use it beyond that? If you would like to zero in on information on X kind of thing, topical, different kinds of topics, stories, how to do things, vocabulary of certain kinds of linguistic properties. The TEI framework allows you to do that. And also from here in that portal setting, again, allow places to have built-in context such as video commentary, demonstrations, readings, any number of things that could then be embedded with it or put in a larger sort of digital, online digital exhibitions setting. So there are a lot of different ways of, there are other resources out there that provide some inspiration for this, but that don't quite get to exactly what we want to create here. there isn't, we're creating this because there really isn't an existing tool that really does all of these things. There are other sites and frameworks that do components of these. So an example is Digital Daisy Bates is a project from Australia that Daisy Bates was a linguist there who recorded tons and tons of word lists from Australian languages. And they, this particular university, I think it's at Melbourne, they digitized all of these. And they did a full transcription of it. This is just a screenshot. I didn't want to link directly to it because of some delay effects that might occur. But what happens is as you scroll through the transcription, it is then tied the other pages on the right, which is the original. You have the handwritten version and the typed up version. Those images switch to align with the transcription you see on the left. So then you can see all versions of it in parallel. So that shows some of the functionality of having this association of transcription and image at the same time. There is the Teacher Project, which is done through Haverford, and this is a great interdisciplinary project with historians and linguists, which is working with Zapotec communities in southern Mexico. And this is a project, Teaches, T-I-C-H-A, and they are working with, there's tons of colonial era Zapotec, documents written in Zapotec. And the project involves getting these scans from lots of different archives in Mexico, big and small, putting them up and doing sort of community-directed transcription of them. So on their site, you get to see, you can sort the different documents that are available. There are, if you are a transcriber, you can do you can work on the transcription. There are, I think people have to be trained to get involved in it because you have to have some knowledge of how to transcribe Spanish paleography. And then there's an additional tab for analysis and translation. And so this is again, a collaborative project that's working with archival documents, and you get this in parallel. However, this is different from what we're trying to do. And this is, there are lots of other projects of this kind that gather materials from different archives and put them in a separate space, like a separate exhibition space. But this information doesn't then get back to the archive in the original archival setting from which the documents come. So it's a little bit different. And then there's the Plateau People's Web Portal, which is based on the Mukudu content management system, which you may have, some of you may have heard of, which is a content management system that's designed for Indigenous communities' needs for presenting and managing their own archival materials, both that they've created and that they've created from, that they acquired from other archives that hold them. So, and this is a great, gives lots of examples of how to sort of create a public-facing portal to sort of communicate to a general public what you want to say about your community, about your nation. And they have a number of different tribes who have done this. They create a landing page, some welcoming information, and then have featured content, both original documents where they have their own metadata, their own commentary about it, but as well as original material that sort of where there's cultural experts explaining how to do different types of things. And Adriana, I'm not sure where I am on time here. Okay, just checking.
You're good for now. I'll flag you in the chat. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to wrap up in a little bit here. So, so to give an idea of because we're in the opening months of this project, we don't exactly have even the best beta version. What's before that would be a gamma version or something. But this is to give you an idea of what we want to have a different way of interacting with it. Right here we have, you have a how it looks right now. You pull up a particular notebook, the pages come up, you can scroll through them. But again, this is just mimicking what you'd be doing in person if it was in front of you. It's not particularly more usable. And this is a screenshot of how you see it in our digital library, where you have the image on one, you have the text image on one side. And on the left you have the search box, which is taking up a lot of space on the page. So in the beginning MockUp version of it, which we're working with the Center for Digital Scholarship here at the APS, and with Rich Shrake, who's our developer, is to create a sort of tentative version where you open up a lot more space on the screen, where you can have on one side the image of the page itself. On the left-hand side, on the bottom, you have the transcription that is then tied to the anchored with the pages on the right. So kind of we saw in the digital Daisy Bates example, as you scroll through if you're scrolling through the transcription, the image on the right will change to align with the text that you're seeing. Or if you're scrolling through the visuals of the pages, the scans of the pages, the text on the left will change. Then we'll also have towards the top of the screen a kind of a table of contents that will anchor it. So here you will actually have a listing of everything that's in the notebook in terms of stories and different sections. So this is an example of a table of contents that Patricia Anderson, the lead linguist, is writing up for one of the notebooks. So these are the kinds of things that we want to have be as a method of navigation of the notebooks. Some people are not going to want to interact with the notebooks in terms of language. Some people won't be studying the language. They'll be looking for they'll just be working with the English content. And having, right now, when you pull up a notebook, it just says notebook 6, and it's 200 pages, and it's really hard to know where to go. But if you then have a table of contents, it gives you a lot more content and information by which to zero in on different sections. And this gives you some of the idea of some of the variety of the content in there. So this is a kind of thing, obviously a lot of the information that's in the notebooks is stuff that requires the expertise of people who can transcribe the language, people who have the cultural knowledge to give commentary about it, linguists who can sort of describe what's going on, how a particular section of elicitation is in relation to a certain kind of grammatical thing that's happening. However, we have, like I said, scores and scores of other kinds of linguistic notebooks of this kind at the APS that are the kind of, whenever we get in touch with or are contacted by an Indigenous community or linguists, these field notebooks of the kind that you're seeing from Haas are always the first thing that people want to work on, because it's really the raw material from which everything subsequent is created in the collections relating to a language. So there is, many of these notebooks have tables of contents. They have structures that we, Paul and I, or other archivists can just drop that in. And this gives being able to then add that in ourselves, even not having any sort of cultural or other knowledge to give context to the collections, just creating an interface structure where we can just create these ourselves as they're created, incredibly opens up the usability of these documents. And so this is a broader thing that we're going to be creating as part of the project as well, to demonstrate its application to other language materials. And we've got a slate of many, many tens of thousands of pages of notebooks that we're also digitizing and creating similar sorts of guides to as part of the project. We're, to sort of close up with some thoughts, one of the reasons we're doing this is there's a lot of projects of this kind that have happened in terms of linguists and Indigenous communities working with archival materials. and creating new resources and fulfilling goals from that. Those types of projects happen all the time. And traditionally, what happens is that the archive's role is very passive in this regard. The archive, someone's approached, and the archive provides the scans of the materials, and something is created. So there's many. This is an example of one that was published in 2015. The linguist Jack Martin was involved in this, and this is working with the Muskogee Creek notebooks that hosted during the same time period as the Tunica ones. And this is a 700-page book that has transcriptions and interlinear translations of the entire set of material. Working also with the descendant community, most of these notebooks were done with James Hill, who was the Muskogee Creek speaker, and also the linguist who worked with the descendants of Mr. Hill created a full website where there's readings of the material. So this is a really impressive thing that was created from APS materials from Haas papers, but there's really no involvement of the archive beyond the providing of the scans. So is there, and all, there are other projects of this kind. Here's what the sort of published notebooks from that Creek volume look like. This is the kind of display that we'll be creating in the Tunica project ultimately as well. All this textual transcription that was done then is not sort of folding back into how the material is going to be presented in the archival setting. If we were able to, the idea with this Tunica project is to be involved as the archive from the beginning stages, so that as this is created, what's created in other settings can also be integrated into the original archival setting where other people might be encountering the originals themselves. There are other projects like this was done with Franz Boas's Chehalis notebooks. An entire publication was done involving a Huron anthropologist and a tribe working with the notebooks here again. This is before we really had the capacity, before we had our CNAIR, Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, before it was really up and going fully enough to be involved. We kind of got them scans and they created this whole thing. There's a lot of really important, valuable information that could be integrated if the tribe wanted it to be the case. They didn't, not required to provide us with that information or involve it in an online portal, but there's like a missed opportunity, some missed opportunities that can happen here. We now, because of our center and because of this infrastructure we're building up, have an ability to be involved, have the archive play a non-passive role in the creation of a resource, if that's how a collaboration would go. So there are existing projects of this kind that are in process that we've gotten to know people, such as this is one involving Edward Sapir's notebooks with the Tunica language, which is in Alberta. Chris Cox, who's a linguist, and Mr. Bruce Starlight, who's one of the fluent speakers who directs their language program. They've done a full transcription of all the Sapir notebooks, and Mr. Starlight has read out every single word in the notebooks and actually filled in information that's missing. And so we're looking, as they finish up their work on that, to be able to integrate it into an online presentation of those notebooks as well. So this is a case where we could integrate the work that they're doing in a way that's mutually beneficial, and with the community's permission, also create a better publicly facing tool and community directed tool for explaining what all this material is and related things like these photographs. I don't really have a good wrap-up thought, but hopefully this is I think it's a good time to stop because I've thrown a lot of information at everyone. But hopefully this kind of shows you the general idea of how we want to create what we want to do with these Tunica materials and how it might be applied to a broader range of things in which it can be applied. I'm rambling, so I'll hand it over to Adriana to direct it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. It's really exciting to learn more about the project, which I've heard about in passing, but it's nice to learn some more details. So we'll open it up to questions. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask Brian, Again, you can either get my attention by raising your hand or flagging me in the chat or on the screen. So James Hill is ready to go. Go ahead, James.
Brian, how many people are working on this project at the moment?
At the tribe itself, there are, I'm going to say about 9 or 10 transcribers doing the transcription work. We started that in October. It got off to a kind of a slow start, but the transcription stage of getting literally everything down in the notebooks is going to go through May. And then there's, on the APS side, there's myself and Paul, who is the other archivist at CNAIR. And then there's our lead linguist, Patricia Anderson, who's directing sort of the transcription project itself, the sort of workflow of all that. And then the second year, we'll be doing more detailed analysis of the language material itself. There's also some people at the tribe, Donna Elizabeth and Elizabeth Mora and John Barbary, who runs the program, who are doing different components of the, there's also one stage I didn't mention, the transcription is Haas wrote down the Tunica language, and she had a particular writing system for how she wanted to represent it. They now have a different, slightly different writing system. So one of the steps is for the language experts, Donna and Elizabeth, to, after the transcribers have written down the Tunica that's in the notebooks, they then transliterate it into the contemporary writing system. So that's another stage they're going to have done through by May is our goal.
Thank you.
Great. I think Donna and Elizabeth are both here too. So if people have questions for them, I would encourage you to, if you're willing to engage.
Yes, and if I've said anything incorrect, please feel free to correct me, Donna or Elizabeth.
Okay, I think Kyle has a question next.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. I think this is a really wonderful sort of capsule summary of a lot of work that it feels like you've been really wanting to do for a while. I'm curious, several of the projects that you shared had sort of that audio component to it. And I wonder, and maybe this is a question for Donna and Elizabeth as well, where does the audio interface with the sort of written transcriptions that you're doing? Could that be a follow-on project where you would put some recordings up, or is that a separate resource that exists someplace else?
Well, I'll say something, and if Donna and Elizabeth want to say something, feel free, but no, not obliged to. I think because one of the potentials of the project, of the material, is to be a teaching and learning resource. I think they have envisioned wanting to have audio examples so people can know how to, what the language sounds like, pronunciation examples. One of the challenges of archival materials like this is they're often even when a very highly structured, very relatively easy to use version, such as how Haas put together things. For example, Boaz's notebooks are notoriously messy and just really difficult to use. These even really easy to use notebooks are not necessarily things that you can just take directly, and they're not in a form where you can directly translate them to language learning. They need to be worked with by teachers and language experts to create something that's then a teaching tool. So I think the use of audio is one way for that. There are some, Haas did do some audio recordings with Mr. Uchigan. They were on wax cylinders. Those are at Berkeley, and those are mostly of music. I don't know that they're as useful as examples of hearing the language because of the sound quality is not that great, however. But I think an audio and video is a kind of thing that people will, everyone likes to use to interact with resources.
Okay, Patrick, I see you up next.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian, for this great talk. It's been great to see, your thinking on this over the years and evolve into a grant, and now getting to see the rubber hit the road, so to speak. So I had to get up during this for a moment, so you might have addressed my question, but I was wondering about, other outcomes of the project. In particular, you've talked about all the ways that this digital resource can be used actively in education, in language teaching and so forth, but what about, journal articles, or how else, what other outcomes or avenues do you see, or discoveries do you see being made through this project? Sure.
Well, this is a good occasion to mention one thing I didn't really get into, which is in the transcription that's being, because we're transcribing this into this Flex database, which is a software for doing linguistic analysis. This is a standard, becoming a standardized tool for a lot of in linguistics. So one of the objectives of the project is to have a body of data that other linguists can use. And so and because the tribe has said, this material is fine for general public use. We want to encourage people studying the language. If people want to study the language and do analysis that helps with our revitalization of the language, then we want to do that. And so the data that is being transcribed and then the analysis that's done will be downloadable as open data. If the tribes also said if there's stuff that in the process of getting into the minutia of the information, if there's certain information that's private information or sensitive, that we can retract that part, but that's not expected that that's going to be very extensive and nothing has jumped out at this point. So from that downloadable data, it will then allow other people to utilize the material to apply it to other projects in linguistics. Tunica is a very interesting language because it's considered an isolate. It's not a part of a larger language family. So the study of linguistic isolates is a very fascinating topic. So we expect a lot of work to be done from this data. And this is, I think a lot of people are paying attention to see how it goes. We also foresee that this tool, which is that's being created, is an open source tool that we're putting out there. And we're also going to be sharing articles and doing presentations at the later part of this project about the tool itself and how this particular process was put together and how it can be potentially implemented by other archives who have similar repository structure. Because there's a lot of tools out there that are, like I said, sort of like this, but not quite. And we actually applied to the grant once and didn't get it and had to reapply to it. And part of the confusion, I think, of some of the people looking at it was a lot of people thought, oh, doesn't this thing over here already do that? Or doesn't this other thing already do that? We really had to explain like how this is fulfilling a niche that doesn't really exist. But I think having it out there in a fully exemplified form will help to also make the case. People will kind of get it when they see it. That's kind of a lot of what I've been saying. So I think there will be a lot of potential from that as well. And a lot to say about the sort of collaborative process as well. And like I said, why it's important for archives to be involved in projects like this, where it's the right fit.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I have a question. So it sounds like that this is going to be happening in stages, that there'll be, there's so much material that's being digitized and put up into this interface that it's impossible to sort of do it all at once. So I'd be curious to hear about your thought process and kind of the conversations involved with prioritizing which materials are going up first, whether or not you're approaching the notebooks kind of in the order that they appear in our catalog, or if there's other conversations that have been in play with the community to kind of prioritize certain information to get up there on the portal and available sooner or later. And I don't know if you could sort of speak to what those conversations have been like.
Sure. Well, so in the larger body of Tunica stuff that's in the Haas papers, as happens with a lot of linguistics, bodies of linguistic material like that, the notebooks are really the material from which everything else was created. So it's a lot of things derived from it. There were these index card files of grammatical and vocabulary forms. There's subsequent analyses that she did of different things. There's subsequent when she typed up and worked things up for eventual publication. There's photographs. The notebooks are really the where it's at. So they wanted to start there. It's also the biggest body of stuff. So starting there was important. During the transcription project, an important thing that came to light was Patricia Anderson, and I think talking with other people too, said the question was, where's the right place to start in the notebook? So we're actually starting with notebook 6 rather than notebook 1. The reason is in the first few notebooks, as this is what I was talking about, being able to follow the process, how Haas and Uchigan were working together, is as she was getting to know him and getting to sort of get her grounding in the language, which she had to do a lot more of because it is not part of another language family. So she didn't really have, she's trying to figure out a lot of fundamental things. I'm told it wasn't really until notebook 6 that she's kind of settled into a groove, that she had a sort of, from there on, she didn't really change her her writing system, her way of representing the language. So they were in a good, so that's a good place to, from which to start, especially for some of the transcribers who are newer to the language. So we're going to starting at notebook 6, going through the end, then going back to notebook 1 through 5, because the 1 through 5 has more kind of irregular things happening, some changes happening in the process. So part of the project is after we've done all the digitization of the notebooks, we're then going to make sure all the other documents that are in Haas's papers are digitized as well. So the derivative things, how to sort of integrate those into the portal is less clear. They're not going to be transcribed in the same kind of way, but sort of making sense of the interrelationship and having them all be available is an important component. I think for the photographs as too, there could be, that's a kind of material where there's potential to give more commentary about, like, what was it, you know, what was it like in the 30s? What was happening in the community at that time, and so forth. So I hope that addresses some of what you're saying.
No, that's great. So we had a question from Pam Hill, who wants to know how many Tunica speakers there are currently.
Well, the one thing, so Mr. Uchigan was the last fluent, what's considered the last fluent speaker. People stress the last known fluent speaker because there were a lot of people of that generation who had different levels of knowledge of the language as well. And for a long time, the language was classified by the organizations that classify the states of language as dormant, but it's been changed to reawakening is the state. So there's a lot of people who have, I would defer to others as to who could be as characterizing levels of fluency, but there's large number of language learners at various stages. The language experts in the tribe who are in the language revitalization program are certainly among the most able. Since I'm not involved in the program directly and don't really know the full range of speakers, I'd say I couldn't give an exact number, but there's people with varying levels of grounding in the language, and the numbers are growing. The reason it got reclassified is because there's been a sharp turn, and there's a lot of lots of momentum, lots of things created. There's an actual working speaking community that's forming. So that's how I would summarize it to the best of my knowledge.